Welcome to Cheater Confessions. Let's dive into today's tale. They say trust is the cornerstone of marriage, but what happens when that foundation gives way? My name is Richard, and up until a few months ago, I believed I had an ideal life. A fantastic job, a stunning wife named Claire, and a home that felt like paradise after a grueling workday. However, life has a knack for hitting you when you're least prepared. Let me take you back to the moment everything started to come apart. I arrived home late that evening. My boss, Brian Mercer, had kept me at the office until nearly 9 o'clock. The man was relentless, but I admired him. He'd guided me for years, helping me climb the corporate ladder. Exhausted from the long hours, I stepped inside, eager to relax. "Claire?" I called out. "In here," she answered from the living room. I found her sitting on the couch, her laptop open, but her attention seemed elsewhere. She glanced up, startled, as if she hadn't anticipated my early arrival. "You okay?" I asked, loosening my tie. "You seem off." "Yeah, just tired. Long day," she replied with a faint smile. Claire often appeared a bit preoccupied. As a freelance graphic designer, her deadlines could be overwhelming. We exchanged brief updates about our day, but before I could settle in, my phone buzzed. Brian's name lit up the screen. "Hang on, I've got to take this," I said, stepping into the kitchen. "Richard." Brian's voice boomed through the line. "Glad I caught you. There's an important event this Saturday evening. A charity gala. Big networking chance. I need you there." "Oh, sure," I agreed, even though the last thing I wanted was to spend my weekend schmoozing with Brian's high society connections. "Should I come alone?" "You can bring your wife if you'd like. These events are always better with a date." He hung up without waiting for my reply. Classic Brian. When I returned to the living room, Claire looked up expectantly. "Who was that?" "My boss, Brian," I said, dropping onto the couch beside her. "He invited me to a charity gala this Saturday night. Apparently it's a big deal, and he insisted I go." Her eyes lit up and a small smile crept across her face. "A gala? That sounds exciting." "Not really. It's more of a work function. Probably boring," I said. Then I added, "He said I could bring my wife, though." "Wanna come?" She hesitated briefly, then nodded. "Sure, I'll go." "You're sure?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yeah," she said, closing her laptop. "It'll be nice to dress up and have a night out." "All right," I said with a shrug. "Just don't say I didn't warn you if it's dull." Claire laughed, her mood seemingly brighter than before. I leaned back against the cushions, pushing aside the uneasy feeling creeping into my mind. For now, everything appeared fine. Little did I know, the gala would mark the start of the unraveling. The evening of the gala, Claire's excitement surprised me. She spent hours getting ready, and when she finally emerged, I was left speechless. Her emerald green dress hugged her figure perfectly, shimmering in the soft light. Her hair cascaded in elegant waves, and her makeup struck the ideal balance between glamorous and understated. I couldn't help but think how fortunate I was. "You look stunning," I told her as she descended the stairs, her smile lighting up the room. "Thanks," she replied, eyes sparkling. "I hope I'm not overdoing it." "Not at all," I said. "You look perfect." We arrived at the venue, a grand ballroom filled with the scent of fresh roses and expensive perfume. The event was already in full swing, with high society guests mingling and sipping champagne. It was the kind of gathering I disliked. Forced small talk and shallow interactions. But it was part of the job, and I had to play along. Brian Mercer was there, of course, imposing as ever, sharply dressed and confident. I led Claire over to introduce her. "Brian, this is my wife, Claire," I said, shaking his hand. He took her hand, flashing a smile that was almost too charming. "Pleasure to finally meet you, Claire. Richard talks about you constantly." "Nice to meet you too," Claire responded politely, though I noticed a flicker of nervousness in her voice. Brian's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than necessary. I caught the subtle shift in his stance, that self-assured, almost predatory demeanor I'd come to recognize over the years. Then he turned back to me. "You've got a good one, Richard," Brian said, his hand resting on Claire's shoulder a beat too long as if to underscore his point. Claire laughed nervously, avoiding my eyes, but I noticed the tension in her shoulders. Thanks, I replied, my jaw tightening. I couldn't pinpoint it, but something felt off. As the night progressed, I started picking up on subtle signs. Shared glances between Brian and Claire when they thought I wasn't looking. His gaze lingering on her a second too long. Private jokes exchanged that excluded me. None of it was overt, but the little things began to stack up. Eventually, I wandered over to a group of coworkers where we spent some time talking about upcoming projects, clients, and the usual office chatter. Despite trying to stay engaged, my eyes repeatedly drifted toward Claire and Brian. At one moment, I looked over to see them in a corner, chatting and laughing like they were sharing a private joke meant just for the two of them. Claire's hand rested lightly on Brian's arm, and he leaned in closer to her. Although I couldn't make out their words, their overly familiar and relaxed body language made my stomach twist. I shook my head, attempting to focus on the conversation happening around me. It's nothing, I reassured myself. Just friendly banter. You're reading too much into it. But the uneasy feeling wouldn't subside. Every time I glanced back, Claire and Brian seemed to be locked in yet another quiet exchange. Their chemistry felt too natural, too effortless. In the days following the gala, I began noticing subtle changes. At first, it was barely perceptible. Claire started spending more and more time glued to her phone, constantly texting or checking messages, always angling the screen away from me when I walked by. Initially, I brushed it off, reasoning that she was likely busy with work or chatting with friends. But then her habits shifted even more. She began going out frequently, often in the evenings, claiming she was meeting friends or attending events I'd never heard of before. It struck me as strange since Claire typically wasn't the type to go out much. Most of her time was devoted to freelance projects, and whatever free moments we had were usually spent together. Yet now she seemed to be inventing reasons to leave, often heading out alone. One night she came home late, carrying a faint scent of perfume. Except it wasn't hers. It was different. A musky, masculine cologne that stood out. At first, I told myself it was an accident. Maybe she'd brushed past someone at the event. But deep down, something felt off. My stomach knotted as I looked at her. Hey, I said as she walked into the living room. You smell different tonight. What's that scent? She hesitated briefly before flashing a quick, uneasy smile. Oh, it's nothing, she replied. Probably from a guy I talked to at the event. He must have been wearing something like that. Her explanation came a little too fast, her smile slightly forced, but I chose not to press the matter. She disappeared into the bathroom without much else to say, which wasn't unusual after a long day. But this time, when she emerged from her shower, something caught my attention. Her skin was still damp, but just below the waistband of her towel, faint bruises marred her hip. They were deep purple, dark and distinct. Marks that looked like someone had gripped her too tightly. The sight of them hit me like a punch. Claire noticed me staring and instinctively reached to touch the bruises. What? She asked. Oh, this? It's nothing. I just bumped into something. I stayed silent, but my thoughts spiraled. Those weren't ordinary bumps. They looked intentional, too specific, too pronounced. She wouldn't meet my gaze, and her hands trembled slightly as she grabbed her leggings from the chair and quickly pulled them on, hiding the marks. The tension between us grew, thick and oppressive, but I couldn't bring myself to question her further. Deep down, I knew her explanation was a lie. I'd seen bruises like that before, ones that didn't come from accidents. The room felt heavier, almost suffocating as Claire finished dressing without looking at me. I opened my mouth to say something but hesitated, letting her walk out of the room without another word. I stood frozen, staring at the empty space she'd left behind, my mind racing. What was going on? 2 nights later, Claire mentioned she was going out with friends again. It was late, around 9, and I couldn't keep ignoring the signs. Something was definitely wrong. I grabbed my keys and decided to follow her. Moving quietly, I slipped out the door and tailed her car, keeping a safe distance as she drove away. The route she took felt eerily familiar, and I struggled to shake the growing sense of dread. She didn't seem to notice me. Her attention was fixed straight ahead. But as we drove further, my heart pounded. The road she was taking wasn't random. It was one I traveled often, heading to work. My stomach sank when she eventually parked in front of a building I recognized immediately. My office. I veered off onto a side street, pulling out my phone with shaking hands. Opening the camera app, I snapped a few pictures as she stepped out of her car. Claire paused, glancing at her phone before walking toward the entrance. That's when I saw him. Brian. He appeared in the doorway, hands tucked in his pockets, wearing his usual smug grin. My heart skipped a beat as I snapped more pictures, barely able to comprehend what I was witnessing. Claire approached him with a slight smile, and the sight left me frozen, struggling to process what I had just seen. She greeted him casually, but the expression on his face was far from professional. Then, just when I thought I'd witnessed everything, they did something that sent a chill down my spine. They kissed. It was brief, but unmistakable. My mind raced as I struggled to process it. Claire kissing Brian, my boss. A lump formed in my throat as I continued to watch. They entered the building together, and Brian quickly turned back to lock the front door, shutting out the rest of the world. My hands trembled so violently that I could barely keep my phone steady. After snapping a few more photos, I hurriedly slipped the phone into my pocket, still trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. They went upstairs, likely to his office, and the mere thought made my stomach churn. I couldn't believe it. I had followed Claire to the one place I never imagined she'd be, with Brian. Sitting in my car, shrouded in darkness, my thoughts spun out of control. I felt betrayed, sick to my stomach, and above all, lost. How had I not seen this coming? How had I missed the signs? I couldn't bring myself to leave. I just sat there, staring at the building where my wife and my boss were now together. The image of them kissing replaying in my mind over and over again. When Claire finally came home, I was waiting. The entire drive back, I had struggled to hold myself together, but my anger and confusion had only intensified. She walked in, her face lighting up at the sight of me sitting in the living room. But as soon as she noticed my expression, she froze. "Richard, what's wrong?" she asked, her voice filled with concern, though I caught a flicker of tension in her eyes. She knew something was off. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and began swiping through the photos before handing it to her. Her face drained of color as she saw the images. Her kissing Brian outside the building, his smug grin, and the way her body leaned so close to his. My chest felt like it might explode. "Richard," she started, her voice unsteady. I can explain." I cut her off, my voice firm but trembling with anger. "Explain? How do you explain this?" I demanded, motioning toward the phone. "You kissed him, Claire, my boss. And you think you can fix this with an explanation?" Her gaze fell to the floor, unable to meet mine. "It's not what you think," she said quietly. "It was a mistake, a moment of weakness." I let out a bitter laugh. "A mistake? A moment of weakness? You've been lying to me for who knows how long, and all this time you were with him. How long has this been going on?" She didn't respond, fidgeting nervously, but I refused to let her evade the question. "I thought we had something real," I said, my voice breaking for the first time. "But I've been living a lie. All the signs, the time you spent away, the distance between us, it was all for nothing." She looked at me, her voice trembling. "I never meant to hurt you. I didn't know how to tell you, but I couldn't stop myself." The betrayal hit me like a punch to the gut. I stared at her, the woman I thought I knew and loved, now a stranger standing before me. "I can't do this anymore. I'm done, Claire. You've made your choice." I took a deep breath. "I'll be filing for divorce. We're over." Her eyes widened in disbelief, and she shook her head, her lip quivering. "Richard, please don't do this. I'm sorry, I made a mistake. We can fix this." I stood up, my chest tight under the weight of my decision. "There's nothing to fix. You've already made your choice. You chose him." As she stood there, tears streaming down her face, I knew that nothing she said could undo what had happened. The trust was shattered, and whatever love we'd shared was gone, replaced by betrayal. "I'm done, Claire," I said again, my voice final. "I'll start the paperwork tomorrow. Pack your things and go. You're not welcome here anymore." She didn't say another word. She just stood there, the silence between us heavy and suffocating. I turned and walked out of the living room, heading toward the back door. I needed air, needed to escape her presence, even for a moment. I stepped into the backyard, shivering in the cold, struggling to make sense of it all. A few minutes later, I heard the door behind me open. Claire had packed her belongings and left. The next morning, I stormed into Brian's office, my fists clenched and my heart still pounding with rage. Without saying a word, I lunged at him, landing a punch squarely on his face. He stumbled back, but I wasn't finished. I hit him twice more, once in the jaw and again in the stomach, watching him collapse into his chair. His eyes widened in shock as he clutched his face, pain and disbelief flashing across his features. "What the hell, Richard?" He spat, wiping blood from his lip. "You think you can do whatever you want?" I snarled, my voice trembling with fury. "With my wife? You think I wouldn't find out?" Brian's expression shifted, a smug grin tugging at his lips. "So what? You think you can storm in here and accuse me?" I didn't let him finish. "It's not just about Claire," I snapped, my fists still clenched. "It's about you abusing your position. You think you can do whatever you want just because you're the boss?" Brian leaned back in his chair, trying to regain his composure, but the smugness lingered. "You're not exactly in a position to complain," he said. "I'm the one who made your career." That's when I laid it all out. "Actually, Brian," I said, pulling a folder from my bag and slamming it on his desk. "I've been documenting everything. Emails, personal expenses, even the messages you've sent to other women in the office." His face drained of color, the smugness vanishing as he stared at the folder. Panic flickered in his eyes. "I'm giving you a choice," I said, my voice steady and cold. "Resign quietly or I take this to the board. Your call." The next day, Brian resigned, citing personal reasons. It wasn't a surprise, but it was satisfying nonetheless. As for Claire, she begged for another chance. She apologized repeatedly, her eyes filled with regret. But it didn't matter. The betrayal had cut too deep, and I couldn't look at her the same way again. I filed for divorce shortly after, and in the settlement, she received nothing. Not a cent. She lost her place in my life, and my trust was gone. I was done. Life moved on, and a few months later, I was offered Brian's position at the company. It wasn't the way I had envisioned climbing the ranks, but there was a certain poetic justice in it. I had reclaimed control, and in a strange way, it felt right. Claire tried to reach out again, but by then, I had moved on. The past was behind me, and I had no interest in revisiting it. Sometimes the only way to overcome betrayal is to rise above it, and that's exactly what I did. Thank you for watching.